Hello, welcome back to the Bald Book Geek. I discovered something, and I don't know how I missed this. I didn't know this existed until Amazon recommended it to me. Buffy, the Last Vampire Slayer. Let's get into it. First things first, what is Buffy, the Last Vampire Slayer? So, following the sort of Buffy reboot of Boom Studio, this takes place in an alternative future. So it's a very different take. This is completely its own thing. 4 issues, completely standalone. So, this comes straight from the Buffy wiki, just to give you an idea. Buffy Summers is the last Slayer. Now in her 50s, she wages a one-woman war against the forces of darkness who prey on humanity in the daylight. Unimpacted thanks to a magical catastrophe that nearly blotted out the sun. The same disaster robbed Buffy of her friends and ended the Slayer line, forcing her into an endless guerrilla war. That is, until she stumbles across something she hasn't seen in a long time. Hope, in the form of a prophecy and a young girl who carries it. I'm going to keep my review as spoiler-free as possible, just because I don't want to ruin it for you. This is... how can I put this without spoiling anything? She needs to save what's left of humanity. She's now in her 50s. She is not in a good place. She is alone. And it's a multiverse story, so think of this as like a Batman Elseworlds story, rather than a Buffy main timeline Buffy story. So, Boom Studio tend to have great artists and great writers on board, and they've really done well with Buffy. This, I think, is probably the strongest thing they've done in terms of Buffy in a long time. The changes to the reality, the changes to the storyline, for example, Tara not dying, and things like that. What would happen? But what would happen if everything went wrong? I still find it interesting that people are upset over Tara's death, but I really do take that at face value. But it needed to happen. You meet Willow's daughter. Willow and Tara's daughter is a witch and a potential slayer. These characters are pulled together by prophecy, by circumstance, and by moments where things just don't go well. The writing is good, the character development is really good, and you end up with these strong characters. Like, this version of Buffy is alone, and she probably has more in common with Batman. It's sort of post-apocalyptic Buffy. She finds hope in this kid, and it just works. And it's the characters you do meet, without naming names, because you don't need to know too many of them. All of these characters, the ones that you do know, have been flipped. So the ones that you do meet, the ones that you know, the ones that you get to know, have been flipped. Their characters are not who you think they are. And thanks to sort of this alternative Earth ravaged by climate change, where vampires walk in daylight in the polluted sky, this sort of amidst this sort of dark dystopia, vampires regime their human cattle. Buffy is hardened, and you realise that she is the key to a bigger story. She always is, but she's Buffy. There is always a what-if scenario, and there is countless multiverse stories now within Buffy's multiverse through Boom Studios, and Boom Studios has been very good for Buffy. And I'm glad that they kind of took over the reins, although I will say there is some fantastic Buffy comics that are not canon, that happened long before by Dark Horse, who are fantastic. And also the canon continuation of the series, of the television show. These are just interesting. The characters will take you on a ride and pull you into this darkened, obliterated, depressing world where very little hope is left. And finding hope and finding freedom and finding humanity is also part of this story in a way that is rarely touched upon in comics. With comic books so depressed and so not in a good place, Boom are doing really well. Do I agree with a lot of the decisions they've made with some of the Power Ranger stuff? No. But when it comes to this whole Buffyverse and how they're dealing with it, and this sort of idea of what if scenarios, this is the book for you. You will love it, you will love this, And genuinely, as a fan of Buffy, it's a great little book. And you end up just pulled in. I read them individually because that's how I read them, but they are coming out as a mass market bind up in August, I think. I have pre-ordered that now because I read them through my local rental thing digitally, and they're fantastic, and I do want a copy on my shelves. They did a continuation of Buffy in novel form in these god-awful, overly fanficky YA novels that were not very good. But this, on the other hand, is, and this idea of what if the worst case scenario, what would happen if Buffy was alone? What would she be? Who would she be? Well written, great character dynamics, great character choices, great story beats, this dark dystopia, these vampires, it's just brilliantly done, and I'm so glad that I read this, and I'm really annoyed that I completely missed this book. I don't know how I didn't know this existed until Amazon. I'm really kicking myself. I wish I'd read this sooner.